use them to actually progress your family tree. And if you're like me, my skeletons are my favorite people. I love my skeletons. See, you can't hide your skeletons, so you teach them to dance. I love my skeletons to dance. So I'm looking very, very much forward to that. That's going to be fun. So we're going to have a wonderful speaker back July the 7th. And so speaking of which, today, Larry Cates, history and genealogy librarian from the High Point Library Heritage Room, right? He's going to give an overview on documenting rootless younger men in North Carolina without property. They were not relatively visible in the census records of the period. When they were still young, mobile, and without property, they could leave very few traces. So he's going to help us with how to follow through on those. I'm very struck this. I've got an uncle who kind of disappeared as a young man, so let's see what I can pick up. So anyway, please help me welcome Larry to our meeting today. Thank you so much, Larry.
Thank you for that warm reception. Now, before you leave today, I have left a few handouts and a brochure back at the corner table near the door, and it tells you a little bit about our upcoming America 250 programming at the library. There's a lot of that going on this year, and our YouTube channel and our book club, which you don't have to be in High Point to participate in, is going strong for 17 years now, so I'm going to put in a plug for my book club. I created this talk a few months ago for a meeting of our local chapter of the Daughters of 1812. It seemed to me that listeners would identify with the problem of tracking restless, rootless young men either along their pathway back to their eligible soldier or in tracing the actual soldier himself, because apart from officers, it's very frequently youth with less means and a more unsettled or impecunious background, one who's looking for adventure, direction, opportunity, or meaning, who ends up on the front lines. And such folks, in spite of being free men, can be very difficult to trace due to the circumstances and their natures. But I think any of us who have done genealogy for very long have encountered situations like this and can appreciate and identify with the problem. So I bet you have experienced this frustration when tracing your ancestors. You're trying to find the father and mother of a man born in the 1820s or the 1830s, say, 18 teens, I mean, and you discover that he married in the late 1840s. So by 1850, he's living in his own household with the woman he wedded a few years prior, and maybe a couple children, and you're hopeful that you'll find him in the prior census years with his family. But instead, this is what meets your eye. A long list of names with a lot of hatch marks over to the right-hand side of them. No names are provided beyond that of the person who heads the household. But all these tick marks are people, and they represent younger men or women in the family, wives, other relatives, nameless, faceless, without definite characteristics other than their free or unfree status, their race, an age bracket, and their gender. And so, although we frequently assume that they are all children of or grandchildren of the heads of household, we cannot really be sure of that, can we? These boys and youths, they could be apprentices, they could be nephews, cousins, hired hands, and not sons. I mean, they could even be tenants, boarders, or students. We have to acknowledge, in fact, that some of them are other kinds of relatives than sons, or simply unrelated, because we know that to be the case after 1850. The implication is that the series of records we've relied upon most heavily in our research up to this point, going back in time, the census, is no longer the lifesaver that we've come to expect. It's not going to give us an easy indicator, just a potential suggestion if one of our ancestors happens to match up with one of these tick marks. And as we go back further in the census, 1820, 1810, 1800, and 1790, the age categories for dependents just get broader and broader. Until by 1790, for males, there are only two categories. One of those is over 16 or under 60, and the other one is under 16 or over 60. Not very helpful at all, right? Before 1790, it's even worse. There will likely be no census at all, certainly no federal census, and we only have tax and tithable lists to assist us, which rarely give us explicit names of sons either. Friends, we're going to have to turn to other records to help clarify who the likely candidates are for the missing parents in our line, and the census will only provide the broadest outline of possibilities. And I mean, we cannot even, be sure that our young fellow was living with a man using the same surname that he later adopted. We can't even be sure of that. It is possible that he lived with an apprentice master, or an employer, or even a stepfather, or a brother-in-law, or a maternal uncle, or that his father died when he was young, or heaven forfend that it may have happened that he was an illegitimate child of his mother, and that he lived with her later husband or an apprentice master because of that circumstance. Our normative assumptions, you can see, can sometimes lead us frightfully astray. Sometimes we have to work hard to suspend our assumptions before we can find the actual truth. These brief remarks that I'm providing today will be a whirlwind tour of where we might find the names of our young, rootless, and sometimes feckless male ancestors prior to 1850. Because that's another complicating factor. The general nature and qualities of many young men of that time and this, and because I am a male, I'm part of the club, I'll say this. The male sex is known in these turbulent teenage years and 20s for unsettled qualities. Wanderlust, just plain lust. Relocation to greener pastures, seeking out adventure and new opportunities. Chances to accumulate property, to make a quick buck, to find a wife. Getting into conquest tests of masculinity with other males. Proving oneself, quarrelsomeness, fragile egos, reckless behavior, and general risk-taking. And unfortunately, some of us never grow out of that. Right? So I don't want to over-exaggerate or over-generalize. Not all boys are the same, but most of them exhibit at least some of these qualities in their youth. And they sow their wild oats. Then they find a place and a person and settle down. It sounds like I'm judging, but I'm not. These very qualities of restlessness and adventure seeking can be socially useful just as easily as they can turn disruptive. And those societies succeed best which are able to channel young men's energies to socially productive ends, into innovation, economic competition, accumulation of capital, martial prowess rather than just hedonistic, self-indulgent, or self-destructive behavior. Now, life wasn't as open-ended in some respects in the 18th and the 19th centuries as it can be today. Most people knew what their occupations were going to be from a very young age. Let's just face it, their options were much more limited. Most would never achieve more than a rudimentary formal education. Most expected to have large families and that they would have to be more or less self-supporting, but would achieve little beyond subsistence level self-sufficiency. Some would remain dependent on their fathers or grandfathers for a long while before achieving independence. And indeed, some patriarchs like to keep very close control of their sons and their daughters throughout their life. Because they owned the means of supporting them, they were able to do that. Many would live on the same land as their forebears, but others would need to find a new place to settle, perhaps in these newly opened lands in the Southwest or the Northwest. Most would be farmers or tradesmen, or more likely both. But the pathway to stability could be rocky then, just as it is now. And because of mobility, extended families could end up widely separated. Since most of the links that tie people to parents had to do with property, we must consider what to do when a young man grows up in one place and leaves long before his father or mother died, perhaps going completely unmentioned in their last wills and testaments, ending up many states away. What happens when father and mother had little to pass on to their children? Nothing that the law would take notice of anyway. Or when families were fractured or forestalled by early death, poverty, or irregular relationships. What are the records most likely to mention young people and young men in particular in those circumstances? I'm asking a lot of questions and giving very few answers so far. Well, it's true that if a child left home and lived far away from the parents or at their deaths, the parent might not mention them at all in a will. I mean, they might presume that their child would be well established by the time of their death, or would be beyond the reach of their help in any case. They may have given something to that son to begin his life in the West before he departed, knowing that they would probably never see him again. There would likely be no record of that gift unless possibly in a deed, maybe some livestock or some cash or household goods. The will might make a perfunctory mention of departed children and leave a small token sum to obviate any later claims they might make that they were forgotten, left out by mistake. But often it won't mention those absent children at all. And that's not the case with intestate estates. So we need to make a distinction between the two types of estates. Estates that have wills and estates that don't have wills. That's the intestate estates. In that case, all the known children are entitled to a share no matter where they might reside or how far away they might be or how long it may have been since they were last heard from. And if they have died, their children will take that portion. And the same is true of an unmarried uncle or an aunt, one without legitimate issue. When that person dies, that estate will mention all the known siblings and their children or grandchildren with entitlement to prorated shares, sometimes generations later, providing as broad an outline as was known by the local family of the extended family. So that is why I always advise, when parents are unknown, as a first step, check every will and estate for a given surname in that area and make notes on each one, whether they seem connected to you or not, to help with the process of elimination. And because the person might be related in a different way, and you'll need that information later, as frequently you do. In this example, that you see on the screen, we find that an uncle of mine named Callahan Parker, a son of Garrett Parker of Montgomery County in this state, father had died in the 1830s. He had a will. The will miraculously survived courthouse fires because problems arose later, and it had to be resurrected, basically, but the widow died in the 1850s. So he had left home quite young, apparently, and was never heard from again. And it became necessary after his mother's life estate and the father's land had expired with her death some 20 to 30 years later that Callahan be declared dead because his father had left him an equal share of the land with two of his brothers. And if potential parents are known to have traveled south or west themselves, one must track them down to see if they left an intestate estate in their place of settlement when they died, which may mention any children they left behind. That's another interesting thing people forget. It may not be the children who left. It could be the parents who left, and you need to track other people of the surname who moved west. This has happened to me several times. It could be south or west, generally here. Since dispersed families wouldn't always know that someone had passed away from whom they might expect a bequest, the court would mandate that a notice be put in a newspaper of record locally over 90 days, hoping that those individuals in other places would be alerted to their valid legal claim. So there's another place to look. If you come from a county where a lot of the records like Montgomery's have been burned, you want to look in the surviving newspapers for legal notices about estates trying to locate heirs who've gone elsewhere. May not be in the public records, but in the newspapers. And sometimes you'll find that a parent died when a son was quite young, and a guardian will have been appointed to handle the property on the child's behalf until they reach the age of majority, which would be why they would not be expected to be found in the under the surname that you expect them to in 1840 and 1830. They could have been living with this guardian or another relative. Note that for young men, that magical age of majority is 21. But as young as 14, they could choose their own guardian in court. For young women, a fully competent legal majority came at age 18. Now, I wonder why the cutoff was higher for sons than daughters. Maybe you wondered the same thing. I mean, could it be because, a youth was expected to take longer to enter into a relationship and achieve a competence of property to become a head of household in full adulthood? But could it also be that authorities knew then as now that young men mature more slowly than women? I doubt that one, but that's actually the case. And also, a young woman would be expected to marry and begin having children at a younger age to an older male who would then take over from her father or guardian and manage her affairs on her behalf. Condescending, but that's how things were arranged in those years. The beauty of a guardianship is that accounts were rendered, like the one you see on the screen, annually by the guardian, as to how property left to the child had been managed in that 12-month period preceding. And that annual statement can give you an insight into their activities, their interests, their possessions, even their education. Look at this example from my ancestor Henry Quick, for example. It's in Marlborough County, South Carolina. And it tells me that in this particular year, the guardian purchased a horse and a hat for him, and also tellingly a substitute for War of 1812 service. I love to put that in because the ladies from the 1812 Society were sitting there, and I had to apologize to them and explain that his father was a Revolutionary War soldier for 5 years in the Continental Line. Apparently, Henry did not follow suit. However, you may find other details in these records. For example, not only purchases of clothing, but tools, school supplies, books, writing instruments. You may even find who educated the child, who the local teacher was, or if they went to college. Not long ago, I was abstracting an estate in South Carolina and found a reference to, in a guardian's account, to tuition paid to a Mr. Ney in South Carolina. Do you know who I'm talking about? Peter Ney, who's supposedly, ended up in Iredell County and supposedly was thought to be the missing Marshall Ney. We know that he entered at Charleston, by the way, and so he was active in both states, teaching locally before he settled down. Whether a doctor was needed in a particular year, suggesting an illness, what trips they made. Some guardians give just the amount spent and to whom paid, but we love the ones that tell us, they go deeper, and they give us precise details for the expenditures. Now, guardianship papers may have been recorded in bound books, called something like guardian accounts or records of guardians, or they may have been kept as loose papers like this, in bundles by themselves in a separate series, or they may have been intermixed with the estate file of the deceased parent. Sometimes they're maintained with the estate, so you need to look in all those places to avoid missing anything. But what about young men whose parents did not die in their youth, or who came from unstable or marginal families? What other records also apply to these young men? Well, unlike females, young men were subject to certain duties and obligations to the larger society, to the local society, the local government. The work they could contribute was considered important enough, for example, that they would be taxed on the basis of their persons, in addition to certain modest property that they might have owned, like horses or cattle. Those levies were exacted through personal property taxation and poll taxing, which literally means a tax on your head, on your person, paid for any able-bodied male between the ages of 16 and 60, or until the court released you from that liability. And if you happen to be researching in a county where these taxes were levied annually, which is everywhere, and here's the big stickler, they kept those tax records every year. Most counties did not keep all their tax records, unfortunately. or even very many of them necessary, then you will see that young man popping up at age 16 for the first time. And maybe he will be living in the same tax district as his father, or his stepfather, or his uncle, or other male relatives. His brothers may pop up in subsequent years. Even if he moves west later, that proximity in a tax list early on could be very telling about who his relations are. That is his native place. That is the place where he had connections. The value of young men's labor is also shown in several other record categories. For example, they were coveted as apprentices to learn a trade even as children. Often the trade was nothing more than the usual farming, but it could be coopering or blacksmithing or tinsmithing, or it could be a millwright's trade, and this usually happened both to orphans with very little to no property and to abandoned and illegitimate children with no other means of support. A typical apprentice bond will appear as a separate document and in court minutes. And usually you should look for both, because one might tell you the parent's name, perhaps just the mother, and whether the child was an orphan or a bastard. And that's something you definitely need to know. The other might not. The age is almost definitely going to be noted, and the trade and the master's name, because the apprentice must work until age 21. So you have to know when he was born. And sometimes the exact date of birth is given. Sometimes they're not real sure about the date of birth, and sometimes, I'm sorry to say, these apprentices were abused, and their exact age was underestimated because the younger he was, the longer you could work him. Be sure to search what newspapers you can as well, because apprentices frequently ran away, and their masters would advertise for them and give a pretty complete description of them, both physically and personality-wise, which can be interesting. Then there are road assignment records. Now, these are plentiful in both North Carolina and Virginia, and the public roads had to be maintained by male citizens, again, between the ages of 16 and 60, and their proxies, who could be either servants or apprentices or slaves. So you could send somebody in your place to do your road assignment for you if they're under your control. And all the men mentioned on a list of road workers assigned to work under an overseer would live within 2 or 3 miles of that road. Many of the men with the same surname in a single list or across that same road's list over several years were relatives or cohabitants in the households with one another. And you can cross-reference that road over many years to see which men of the same surname appear over decades if you have good explicit records to work with. You can compare the road list with census and tax lists to see what older responsible men of that surname were in that same locality. And that person might be the father or an older male relative of the younger men. In the South, you might also see young men assigned to the unenviable task of patrolling or patrolling, which was monitoring slaves found off their plantations at late hours. But usually these are sons of slave owners and slave owners themselves, not unpropertied men. So they're much easier to trace in general. Now then, beyond that, there are militia muster rolls and court-martial records. And you can find a lot of young men there, obviously, along with older ones, exercising in arms under their local captain, who had a district that has precisely one location within the county, in preparation to deal with unrest or invasion, particularly useful for the War of 1812, because that was a real fear at the time. They're like our National Guard today. They are the predecessor of the National Guard. Now, these exercises would happen maybe twice a year of drilling and assembling, and those who failed in their duty to bring well-maintained arms or to appear at all were subject to inquiry and discipline. There are young men in the muster rolls who moved elsewhere before their parents died and might not be mentioned in their final wishes. Young men over 18 could also serve as witnesses to deeds, bonds, and promissory notes, and so the persons they witnessed legal documents for might be family connections. That's always something to keep in mind. Certainly people in the same neighborhood as they were accustomed to being in. So compare these to other lists to place them geographically in relation to their potential kin. And finally, any boy over 13 or 14, say, might serve as a chain bearer on a land grant. That's how I found the kinship group of Garrett Parker, right up here. I told you earlier that Montgomery County was a burned records county before 1843. So though most of those local records are just completely gone, the land grants were kept on the state level. So they remain in the Secretary of State's papers and they are accessible. And we can see him intermeshed with his father, William, and his brothers, John and William Jr. in these records, all on the same waterway on the eastern side of the Petey Yadkin River. These are indeed his family. Finally, don't forget voting on poll lists. Young men over 21 were enabled to vote. And depending on property qualifications in place at the time, and that changes over time, they might be able to vote for lesser offices only, like assemblyman or a sheriff. Once they obtained land, they could vote in elections for higher offices. So I found ancestors in polling lists with other men of the same surname at a particular voting station, and I consider that a clue as to relationship, because why wouldn't you go with your kinship group to vote? It was also likely you'd get drunk, since candidates customarily offered inducements of potent potables at the polls. Even George Washington did that, by the way. And what young man can turn down free beer, wine, or hard cider? So I have a specific relevant example of that coming up, which you will see. It's right here, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute. For this last category, I mentioned an area of legal records which indicate young men venturing into independent business, trying to get an economic toehold and a competency to start a family. Now, it would be hazardous for anyone to enter into a legal contract with a child, but once a boy reached 21, and even before, he might begin to venture into some legal arrangements for himself. Young men, often teenagers, will, for example, begin to record their flesh marks in courts when they acquire cattle or hogs. That's a sense that they're getting up toward the higher teens. Flesh marks are usually marked in the ear, and they were made to one's livestock to distinguish them from those of others. Because for much of the year, you may not know this, most livestock were let out to forage in the woods and wastelands. And marks were the only way to distinguish them from the property of others and to prevent theft. A lot of people are accused of stealing property by changing flesh marks. Young men will enter into debts, usually borrowing money, but sometimes lending it. And they will be paid for work that they've done for others. Those records may involve court cases to recover debt, or an estate records of a creditor or a debtor who paid them money. And if you look in the loose or dismissed court papers, you may even find their promissory notes as creditors tried to recover what they were owed. So in South Carolina, there were huge ledgers of judgments and summary process that involved small interpersonal debts. And you may find that a young man used a security to guarantee repayment to his creditor, and that this person is likely a close friend or relative. And the witness's name to a promissory note could also be a connection. So, as it is in this case with Aquila or Aquil Johnson, who was my fourth great-grandfather. So, I had a little promissory note that I found after many years of looking for it, looking through every civil action paper in Orange County that I could find through the 1840s. And it is the only evidence I have of his name appearing alongside that of another Johnson male of his age or older in a public record. It turns out the man who's listed as a witness on this note, Duke Johnson, ATDNA study has shown that he was indeed a close relative. Duke was a very poor man. At one point, he was even committed as an inmate to the Alamance County poorhouse, along with his entire family. Duke or Marmaduke later resettled in McDowell County in western North Carolina, and several of my close relatives who've done DNA testing show clusters which combine numerous descendants of Aquila Johnson with numerous descendants of Duke Johnson down many different lineages. So there's absolutely no doubt that they were close relatives. And that little record, that little promissory note, was not found in vain. And then throwing back to that earlier reference I made about polling lists, this is a polling list from Orange County from the late who voted for various offices in this locale on a particular day. Note that Duke Johnson on the right and Ackle Johnson, who's number 6 on the right, Duke is number 3, you see there. They're very close to each other on that list, like they were standing in line close to each other. And next to Duke was a man named Ransom Johnson. And I recognized that name immediately. And we'll get back to it in a minute. Now, the places to look for young men's names are not always easily accessible, as you can divine from all the things I've just said. And you may have to do a lot of skimming in archives and courthouses like I had to do. But increasingly, they will be more and more available with less and less effort. Don't neglect Family Search or the new full text search that is powered by AI-generated handwriting technology there. It's a quick way to search much of what Family Search has collected via the Genealogical Society of Utah and the LDS Church from all over the world. Although the English language is the most prominent now and some of the Romance languages, they're continuing to expand this AI-generated indexing to other languages and places and scripts from different time periods. And every day, people are making startling discoveries because the AI large language models, once adequately trained and acclimated to a particular handwriting style, is awfully good at getting it right. Maybe 80% of the time in English right now, back to the 18th century. When a person's name is repeated several times in a court action or a sales list, for example, it may get the name wrong 5 times, but if it gets it right 1 time, that's all you need. You're in, right? You read around it. You read where you found the hit. And there are certain ways to best construct your search using delimiters and wildcards, and you must try different versions of the same name, first and last, in different word order, last name first, first name last, different nicknames and abbreviations for names like J and O for John, instead of just going with John all the time. But you will be amazed by what you find for a locality and a particular name, stuff it would have taken you years to find manually. And you can search across country when young men are on the move and have a relatively unusual name. Don't neglect that opportunity. Sign up before your Family Search username and password today. It's free of charge. And it's easy to find these incidental and obscure mentions of young men with their associates in some of these record categories. Many North Carolina civil action papers, for example, have been read, not all, and criminal have not been touched at all, which is why criminal is, which I've always loved, is my bailiwick at the moment. All the estate files have been done, for example, all the deeds, the wills, the land grant surveys, with their young men serving as chain bearers. I mean, there's no excuse to miss anything, but remember to do it iteratively with very different versions. Even think about how a letter might be misread in a name and change that letter out or put a wild card where that letter would be. Do you remember the earlier example of Callahan Parker being declared dead because of a landed bequest from his father that lay in limbo for 30 or 40 years? Well, I never found Callahan using the census or any other conventional means. I just presumed, because I couldn't locate him in the census, and we have had good census indexing for a long time, that the document from the 1870s when he was declared dead, that must have been correct, that he just went somewhere and something happened to him and he didn't have any offspring. And one day I thought, okay, this is a good job for a full search, a text search, so I'm just going to put his name in several different ways and see if I can find it. And guess what? I came across him in Union County, Arkansas. He's from Montgomery County, North Carolina. He ends up in Union County, Arkansas. He wasn't apparently in any census record, but he married Nancy Bishop in June of 1850, aged 33 years, and he had a daughter. But he joined Company I, 3rd Regiment Arkansas Infantry, and was wounded at Gettysburg in the thigh and died soon thereafter at Chester Hospital, and was buried at Philadelphia National Cemetery. So here is that mobile, adventurous type who just leaves and is never heard from again, so that his family of origin considered him dead, but he wasn't He has descendants. And here I just wanted to give another specific example of how full-text search has revolutionized my research. We discussed my ancestor Aquila Johnson and the mystery of his family of origin in earlier slides. I started out with a Bible record in that research effort, not written by Aquila himself because we know that he was illiterate, but probably by his son, my great-great-great-grandfather, William M. Johnson, which stated that Aquila was the son of Ransom and Susan Johnson. When I found that, I was so excited. I thought, oh, I would never have figured it out otherwise. Aquila was born in 1812, but then I started looking for a Ransom Johnson in records, and I found one. He was never the head of the household in any census record. He never purchased land. He got married about 1830, and he was in a few civil actions and criminal actions after that. He's in that polling list that you see with Duke and Aquila that day in the late 1840s. But beyond that, I thought, okay, if he's old enough to be their father in the 18 teens, where is he before the late 1820s? And I told you, I had gone through every Orange County record that I could possibly put my hands on in the old days when you have to look through everything. I'd gone through all the civil actions, all the criminal actions. I had gone through the estate books looking for his names in purchasing or owing money to any estates. I looked in Chatham County, I looked in Orange County, I looked in Guilford County, I looked in Randolph County. I never found him before the late 1820s. So how could he possibly be the father of Aquila Johnson like the Bible told me he was? So I know that this Johnson family is very poor. There are a lot of illegitimate children born into it. I thought, okay, this guy, his mother was probably named Susan, but I bet he made up a name for his father, like some of his descendants did when they had to declare who their father was, and it was his brother or his cousin that he called his father, but it really wasn't his father. Then, okay, now I'll look for this Ransom Johnson using full-text search. And I found a land grant from 1804 for someone in that right area of the county on the border with Guilford County, near the Fogelmans there, right neighborhood. And there he is in 1804 on the survey of land acting as a chain bearer. So can a man who was a chain bearer in 1804 have a child born in 1812? Absolutely. Has to be. I mean, I had no reason to doubt, except I had never found any record of him before that. He's one of those tick marks in those later census records that just never shows himself. A full-grown man. And with a family. So that's my spiel. And I'm giving you reference to our YouTube channel where you can see other videos that we produced on different topics. It's called Heritage Deep Dive. I'll open myself to questions, but if you have a question later, you can contact me at the email address there, or you can call us, the Heritage Research Center. Anybody got a question?
To find a lot of this stuff, you just have to walk around. Is it the state archives or?
We're lucky in the state that most of our local records of older vintage have been collected in one place. So if it survives and is considered of some interest or value long term, it's at the state archives. And they've done a great job of preserving their materials, unlike some places. South Carolina is good too. They've done a lot of work to gather everything into one place. There's still things that they don't necessarily have, and they have not preserved them to the level that the state archives in North Carolina has. In North Carolina, for example, you know, I told you I love criminal papers and court papers generally. When you go to South Carolina, in North Carolina, they're all flattened out. They're all like stabilized, you know, with various treatments, and they put in files by date, and by court, you just look through it. You know, if you know a case occurred during a certain period of time, you can look for the papers. In South Carolina, they're still in bundles wrapped in paper and tied. They bring it out in a folder for you to untie, unwrap, unfold, and every time that happens, plus they will not let you just go through them sequentially. You have to ask for one case. So, very different. Those road lists, I love those, where people are assigned to work on roads. Those are very good at locating people in the early 19th century. Those can be in a docket by themselves, like a bound book, or they can just be loose papers filed chronologically in North Carolina. And you just have to go through them. And nobody paid much attention to them except for geography and local history purposes to see where the roads were. They weren't focused on the names. A man named Stuart Dunaway has published a lot of those records for different counties in North Carolina, but he didn't index the names. And he was focused on the geography. You know, it's perfectly fine, but it just isn't what I'm looking for.
Kind of all that same thing. Some relatives that I've had past generations, several, at late 1800s, early 1900s, they think that they probably worked on the railroad. I mean, are there any comprehensive places where people could go to find rosters of people who worked on railroads other than the census?
Well, if they've joined a union associated with their railway work, that would be one place to look. And then you would need to see who acquired the corporate records of the railway and whether they were put into public archives, needing to know specifically which railway you're dealing with. They can be inherited down a chain through a bunch of corporate acquisitions. Oftentimes the older ones will go into the archives, like the North Carolina Railroad has a lot of material up at the state archives. It just depends. And then a lot of people who worked on the railroad were convicts. I'm not saying your ancestor was a convict, but that's a real problem, right? I mean, because those people were very much mistreated, many of them, and they didn't keep very good records sometimes. State prison is another issue, where young men disappear. Maybe they committed a terrible crime, they ended up in state prison. Those registers can be open only if you know the name of who you're looking for. They're not open just to look page by page. I think that might have changed recently, but when I tried to look at them, that's what I was told. Give us a name, we'll show you that page and only that page.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's because of liability.
I just got a situation where it's a great uncle that basically disappeared that was known to go out and work on various railroad crews.
Right.
And then when he'd get tired, he would hobo back into where the family was and hang around for, a few weeks, and then he'd go off and work on another railroad. So, but he just disappeared, so it's...
Yeah, and if people change their names, see, that's one of the most difficult things of all, when they decided to just change the name.
Mm-hmm.
Genetics is really the only way to overcome that.
Mm-hmm.
We have an ancestor who, John Spoon, he had a son named Peter, and the story is that Peter just decided to go off with a friend. He had a friend, and he never was heard from again. And it wasn't until we found descendants of his being matches in that family cluster that was associated with our nearer Spoon kin that we figured out which Peter he was, that he ended up in Missouri.
Okay.
And there'd always been many theories about that Peter, and they were all wrong.
Yeah.
We're living in the age of miracles, I don't think people realize that sometimes. If you've been doing it since 1989, though, you realize it or before, like I have. But I'm glad that we started out very analog, because we learned so much, and we know how to give context to what we're finding and interpret what we're finding, and we know to look at places that other people ignore because it's not digitized yet.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Well, thank you for patiently listening, and hopefully you'll be pleased in June. Is it June I'm coming back?
July, I think.
July.
July.
That one is really full of salacious details.
All right.